Good evening. In April of 1956, a Hungarian physician sat alone in a small laboratory in Budapest. The city outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before things change. He had spent months preparing for this moment. He had synthesized the compound himself, extracted it from plant material, verified its purity. He had already tried taking it orally, had swallowed increasing doses for weeks, and felt nothing at all. So on this particular evening, he loaded a syringe. He pressed the needle into his own arm. He waited. 60 seconds passed, and then the walls of the laboratory began to dissolve. What he saw in the minutes that followed, the colors he described as coming from somewhere behind color, the presences he encountered that seemed older and more intelligent than anything he had a framework for, would stay with him for the rest of his life. He was a scientist, a psychiatrist, a man trained to classify and explain, and what he had just experienced could not be classified, could not be explained. He would spend decades trying anyway. But here is the thing that makes this story something other than just the history of a drug. Long before that laboratory, long before Budapest, long before the word scientist existed, in the deep green darkness of the Amazon basin, men and women had been drinking a dark, bitter preparation by firelight and arriving at the same place, describing the same beings, speaking of the same presences with the same quiet awe and the same residue of dread. The molecule they had both encountered was 14 atoms long. It weighed, in molecular terms, almost nothing, and it existed, right now, inside your body. This is the history of N N-Dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the most powerful, most inexplicable, and most quietly disturbing psychedelic compound ever discovered. Before we go further, if these quiet journeys help you rest, hit like and subscribe right now before you close your eyes. That way, you will always have a safe, quiet place to return to when the night is long. Then drop a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. It moves me every time how many corners of the earth gather here in the dark. But for now, set your phone face down and let us begin. We begin as so much of human history begins, in a cave. Not a metaphorical cave, a literal one, a rock shelter in the high desert of southwestern Bolivia, at an elevation where the air is thin and cold and the stars at night are so dense they seem to have weight. The shelter is called Cueva del Chileno. Its walls bear ochre paintings made by hands that are long gone. Its floor holds the accumulated debris of human presence stretching back 4,000 years, ash and bone, and the small remnants of daily life compressed by time into layers, one on top of another, like the pages of a book no one intended to write. In 2010, an anthropologist named Jose Capriles was excavating a section of that floor when his team uncovered something that did not immediately seem significant. It was a small bag, a pouch, perhaps the size of a man's hand, sewn together from the snouts of 3 foxes. The stitching was careful, deliberate. Someone had made this with patience and intention. Inside the pouch, wrapped and stored with similar care, was a collection of objects: carved bone spatulas, a hollow tube made for inhaling powder through the nose, wooden trays with shallow depressions worn smooth by use, a coil of rope made from plant fiber, and residue. Organic residue that had survived 1,000 years in the cold, dry air of that high Bolivian shelter. When Capriles brought the pouch to a laboratory for chemical analysis, the results came back quietly remarkable. The residue contained harmine, it contained harmaline, and it contained traces of a compound called N N-Dimethyltryptamine, the shaman to whom that pouch had belonged, and it was almost certainly a shaman's pouch, a healer's kit, a spiritual practitioner's assembled tools. Had lived approximately 1,000 years ago, he or she had been, without question, working with the precise combination of chemicals that would later come to obsess the Western scientific world. But the pouch was not the oldest evidence. The oldest evidence could not be found in caves or in laboratory analyses, because it existed in a form that does not survive. It existed in knowledge, in oral traditions, in the slow, careful transmission of understanding from one generation of healers to the next, across centuries, in languages that left no written record. The Shipibo, Conibo people of Peru, the Tucano of Colombia, the Shuar of Ecuador. Dozens of indigenous nations spread across the vast green interior of the South American continent, each with their own relationship to a preparation they had different names for: Yage, Daime, Ayahuasca, Natem, but which the wider world would eventually come to know by the Quechua name, Ayahuasca, vine of the soul, or in one translation, vine of the dead. The preparation requires two plants. This is the part of the story that deserves a moment of genuine stillness, because what it implies is either one of the most extraordinary accidents in human history, or something that challenges our understanding of how knowledge moves through the world. The first plant is the Banisteriopsis kapi vine, a thick woody climber that winds through the forest canopy of the western Amazon. When its bark is macerated and boiled, it produces a dark liquid that contains a family of compounds called Harmala alkaloids. These compounds, harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, have their own mild effects on the mind, but their most significant chemical function is something far more specific than that. They inhibit a class of enzymes in the human digestive system called monoamine oxidases. Monoamine oxidases are, among other things, responsible for breaking down a particular class of molecules before they can reach the brain. They are the body's gatekeepers for certain chemical signals. And one of the molecules they are most efficient at destroying is dimethyltryptamine. Under ordinary circumstances, if you were to swallow DMT, pure extracted, pharmaceutical-grade DMT, nothing would happen. Your stomach would dismantle it within minutes. It would never cross into the bloodstream in any meaningful quantity. It would never reach the brain. You would feel nothing at all. This is precisely what Dr. Szára discovered in 1956. Though we will return to him in time. The second plant in the ayahuasca preparation is most commonly Psychotria viridis, a small unremarkable shrub whose leaves contain in concentrated form dimethyltryptamine. On its own, the shrub's leaves would produce no effect whatsoever if swallowed. The digestive system would eliminate the compound long before it could act on the mind. But when the DMT-containing leaves of Psychotria viridis are boiled together with the MAOI, containing bark of Banisteriopsis kaapi, when these two plants are combined, brewed down over hours into a dark and bitter liquid, the mathematics change entirely. The Harmala alkaloids from the vine disable the enzymatic gatekeepers. The DMT from the leaves is allowed to pass. It enters the bloodstream, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and within the hour, the world, as the drinker understands it, ceases to exist. What the Amazonian shamans had done, without any instrument more precise than their own accumulated observation and the whispered transmission of their predecessors, was solve a pharmacological puzzle of formidable complexity. To combine these two plants in the correct proportions, to understand that one was necessary for the other to function, to select them from a pharmacopoeia of perhaps 80,000 plant species in the Amazon basin. This required knowledge, deep, specific, transmissible knowledge. When Yetzmai, Western scientists and anthropologists eventually arrived and asked the shamans how they had come to know this, the answer was consistent across traditions and across languages. The plants had told them. This is one of those places in history where the scientific mind and the indigenous mind look at the same fact from different sides of an unbridgeable distance. The scientist hears the shaman's answer and reaches for a rational explanation. Centuries of trial and error, perhaps, systematic experimentation across generations, the gradual accumulation of empirical knowledge expressed through the only framework available. The shaman, for his part, does not feel that anything needs explaining. The plants communicated. This is what plants do if you know how to listen. What neither can entirely account for is the precision. Not just the combination of plants, but the specific preparation, the long, slow boil, the addition of certain other ingredients in certain traditions, the proportions. The ritual context that shamans maintain is not peripheral, but central to what the brew does. These are not the products of accidental combination. They carry the weight of systematic understanding. But set aside, for a moment, the question of how the knowledge was acquired. Consider instead what the knowledge reveals about the experience itself. Because the shamans did not speak of the ayahuasca journey in the way that Western culture would later speak of a drug experience. They spoke of it as travel, as contact, as a journey to a place that exists. Not a place constructed by the mind in its altered state, but a place that the mind, in its ordinary state, simply lacks the capacity to perceive. They spoke of beings who lived in that place, entities, presences. The specific character of these presences varied somewhat between traditions. In some, they were ancestors. In others, they were plant spirits. In others, they were vast and ancient intelligences with no clear human equivalent. But the structural description was consistent in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The beings were perceived as separate from the self. They were perceived as knowledgeable, as possessing information or understanding that the traveler did not bring with them into the experience. They communicated, though not always in language, and they were, almost universally, described as having been there before the traveler arrived, not summoned, already present. The ceremonies in which ayahuasca was drunk were not recreational occasions. They were conducted at night, guided by a trained shaman who had typically spent years or decades learning to navigate the space the brew opened. The shaman sang intricate melodic patterns called ikaros, which were understood to be not compositions, but transmissions, songs received from the plant realm, and used to guide the ceremony and protect the participants. The process could last 6 hours. The physical experience was often profoundly uncomfortable, nausea, purging, the body insisting in the most visceral terms that something profound was happening to it. And through all of that, the journey continued. For centuries, this knowledge remained entirely within the communities that held it. The rainforest was not, from the perspective of the 16th, 17th, or 18th century, a place that European civilization considered important in the ways that mattered to European civilization. Missionaries moved through it. Soldiers moved through it. None of them were paying attention to what the indigenous people were drinking by firelight. It was not until the middle of the 20th century that the wider world began, slowly and somewhat accidentally, to notice. The man most responsible for that noticing was a botanist from Harvard named Richard Evans Schultes. He had a quiet, almost monastic dedication to the plants of the Amazon, and he spent decades traveling through regions of Colombia and Peru and Ecuador that most people of his background had never visited and had no intention of visiting. He documented, he collected specimens. He participated with the measured curiosity of a trained scientist and the respect of someone who understood he was in the presence of knowledge older than his own tradition. Schultes never became famous in the way that some of the figures who followed in his wake became famous. He was not a showman. He was not drawn to controversy. He wrote in precise, technical language for audiences of other botanists and ethnopharmacologists. But what he documented, the plants, the preparations, the ceremonial context, the biochemical patterns, he could perceive without yet having the chemical tools to fully describe them, created a record that would eventually reach the people who did have those tools. And in the years after Schultes was making his careful notes in the field, in the clean, fluorescent-lit laboratories of North America and Europe, scientists were beginning slowly and from an entirely different direction to approach the same molecule. They did not know it yet. The molecule had been created, stored, and largely forgotten. It sat in a glass vial in a Canadian research institute, unnamed in any practical sense, unconnected to anything that would have made its significance apparent. It was, for now, just a compound, a molecule that had been synthesized during a routine exploration of alkaloid chemistry, noted in a paper and set aside, stored in silence, entirely unaware, as molecules are, of what it was about to become. There is a particular kind of discovery that history does not know what to do with. Not the dramatic kind, not the eureka moment, not the flash of insight, not the story that writes itself into legend while the discoverer is still alive to enjoy it. This other kind of discovery is quieter. It happens in the margins of something else. A man working on one problem stumbles sideways into something he does not recognize as significant, notes it carefully because that is what careful scientists do, and files it away. He publishes a paper. A small number of people read the paper. Life continues. The world, entirely unaware of what has just been added to it, moves on without ceremony. In 1931, in a research laboratory in Canada, a German-born chemist named Richard Helmuth Friedrich Manske sat down at a bench and synthesized, for the first time in recorded history, a molecule called N N-Dimethyltryptamine. He was not looking for it. Manske had been born in Berlin in 1901, had emigrated to Canada with his parents as a child, and had spent his academic life building a reputation as a meticulous and gifted alkaloid chemist. His doctoral work had been done at the University of Manchester, where he had studied the structures of harmine and harmaline, two compounds you may recognize from the previous chapter of this story, the Harmala alkaloids found in the Banisteriopsis Kaapi vine. He had synthesized those compounds years before anyone understood what they would eventually be used alongside. He had no way of knowing. The world of organic chemistry in the 1920s and 1930s was a world of structural puzzles, of understanding what molecules looked like at the atomic level, of mapping the invisible architecture of the natural world. The question of what these structures did to the human mind was, in most laboratories, a separate department of inquiry entirely. When Manske synthesized DMT in 1931, he was working on what is known as a systematic exploration of the methyltryptamine family, a methodical mapping of related chemical structures. The synthesis was successful. The compound was noted. The quantities produced were, however, too small for the kind of structural analysis that would have told him much about what he had created. And so he did what any careful scientist does, with a result that cannot yet be fully investigated. He stored it. He noted it in the literature. He moved on. The paper was published. The molecule sat in its container. For 15 years, nothing happened. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The molecule that would one day be described as the most powerful psychedelic compound ever discovered. The molecule that was already unknown to anyone in that Canadian laboratory, flowing in trace quantities through the bloodstream of every human being in the world, sat in a glass vial in a research archive, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The right question, it turned out, was not the one Manske had been asking. It came from a different direction entirely. And it came, as so many important questions in the history of pharmacology have come, from someone who went looking for something else. In 1946, a Brazilian microbiologist named Oswaldo Gonçalves de Lima was studying the root bark of a plant called Mimosa tenuiflora, a thorny shrub that grew in the dry scrubland of northeastern Brazil in the state of Pernambuco. The plant had long been used in local folk medicine, and de Lima was interested in characterizing its chemical constituents. From a sample of root bark he had collected near the town of Arcoverde, he isolated an alkaloid. He measured its properties. He named it nigerine, after the dark color of the extract. He published his findings. The scientific community received them with moderate interest. De Lima had found something. What exactly he had found would take years and some controversy to fully establish. Later analysis would suggest that his extracted compound contained a trace of oxygen that pure DMT does not contain, that what he had isolated was either slightly impure or represented a closely related but distinct molecule. Jonathan Ott, a careful and rigorous chemist who reviewed the case years later, concluded that nigerine could not be considered an unambiguous identification of DMT. The matter remains, in the technical literature, a footnote of gentle scholarly dispute. But the direction of inquiry had shifted. Someone was now looking at plants and finding something in the tryptamine family. Someone was now asking what was inside the vegetation of the South American interior. And in the chemistry of that question, the molecule's long silence was beginning to end. The cleaner confirmation came in 1955. A team of American chemists, led by Evan Horning, a precise and systematic researcher whose work is less remembered than it deserves to be, analyzed the seeds and pods of Anadenanthera peregrina, a tree whose seeds had been used for centuries by indigenous peoples of northern South America and the Caribbean to prepare a powerful hallucinogenic snuff called cohoba or yopo. The seeds were ground to powder and inhaled through bone tubes, inducing visions that shamans used for divination and healing. The cultural record of this practice stretched back in various forms over many hundreds of years. The chemistry behind it had never been formally investigated. Horning's team found two major compounds. The first was bufotenine, a tryptamine that was already known and had already been studied. with decidedly unpleasant results, administered at high doses to prison inmates in Ohio, in a style of research that would make a modern ethics board reach quietly for a glass of water. The second compound was N N-Dimethyltryptamine. This was, unlike the dilemma case, unambiguous. The identification was clean. DMT was in the plant, and DMT was, apparently, what the cohoba snuff had been delivering to the minds of those shamans for centuries. Not bufotenine, as had been assumed, but the compound that Manske had synthesized quietly in 1931, and that had been sitting in storage ever since. Now the molecule had two lives simultaneously. It existed in a laboratory archive, and it existed in plants that human beings had been using for spiritual purposes for hundreds of years. But these two facts had not yet collided. The chemists who confirmed DMT in Anadenanthera seeds were not, for the most part, deeply interested in the anthropological dimension of their finding. They had answered a chemical question. What the compound did to the human nervous system was still, at that moment, entirely unknown to Western science. Unknown to Western science, that qualifier is important. Because in the Amazon, in the high Andes, in dozens of communities that would never publish in peer-reviewed journals, the answer to that question had been lived and transmitted and refined and understood. Not in the language of receptors and neurotransmitters, but in the language of experience, for as long as the practice had existed. The Western laboratory and the Amazonian firelight were moving from opposite directions toward the same molecule. They would not meet for another year, and when they did, it would be in a small research hospital in Budapest, at the hands of a man who had been trying and failing for weeks to understand why the compound refused to act. But before we arrive there, it is worth pausing on something that the chemists of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s could not have fully appreciated, something that would only become clear decades later, and that remains, even now, one of the most quietly unsettling facts in the entire history of pharmacology. DMT was not only in the plants, it was in the animals. More specifically, it was in the mammals, in their blood, in their urine, in their cerebrospinal fluid, the clear liquid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, in their brain tissue itself, in humans, in rats, in every mammal that researchers would eventually think to test for it. The first formal indication of this came in 1961 when Julius Axelrod, a biochemist at the National Institutes of Health in Washington, who would later win the Nobel Prize for his work on neurotransmitters, published a paper in the journal Science. He had found an enzyme in rabbit lung tissue that was capable of converting tryptamine into DMT, an enzyme, a biological mechanism, not a contaminant, not a trace from dietary sources, but an active enzymatic process whose apparent purpose was the synthesis of this compound within living tissue. The enzyme was called indolethylamine N-methyltransferase, INMT. Its existence meant something with enormous implications, though at the time those implications were largely left unspoken. If the mammalian body contained an enzyme whose function appeared to be the manufacture of DMT, then the mammalian body was, in some capacity, making DMT. Why? That question would not be seriously pursued for another 3 decades. But it had been asked, quietly, in the margins of a technical paper, almost as a footnote to a more conventional study of neurotransmitter metabolism. The question had been placed into the literature. Why does the body make this? The structural relationship of DMT to other molecules in the body deepened the puzzle. DMT is a tryptamine. So is serotonin, the neurotransmitter most commonly associated with mood, well-being, and the regulation of emotion, the molecule that antidepressants are typically designed to influence. So is melatonin, the hormone that governs the body's relationship with darkness and sleep. These molecules share a molecular skeleton. They are chemical cousins. And DMT, the compound that dissolves the walls of laboratories and sends the mind into encounters with entities, sits among them structurally, like a family member at a quiet dinner, present, unremarked upon, belonging, the 14-atom molecule that Manske had synthesized without understanding, that Delima had found in plant roots, that Horning had confirmed in ceremonial snuff, that Axelrod had found the machinery to produce inside living tissue. This molecule was not, it was becoming clear, a foreign substance. It was not an exotic chemical that human beings happened to encounter by drinking a preparation made from Amazonian plants. It was something the body already knew, something the body was already in trace quantities producing. For what purpose, nobody could yet say. There is a word that researchers use when they discover a compound of unknown function inside a living system. They call it endogenous. It simply means produced from within. An endogenous compound is one that the organism makes for itself, using its own biochemical machinery, for reasons that evolution has presumably preserved across millions of years, because those reasons served some function. Serotonin is endogenous, melatonin is endogenous, dopamine is endogenous. These are the molecules of the interior life, the chemical substrates of mood and motivation, and the body's relationship with time. They belong in the architecture of the conscious mind. They are not accidents. They are not noise. And DMT, it was becoming clear, was endogenous too. The shaman in the Bolivian cave, 1,000 years before any of this, had reached into his fox snout, pouch, and prepared the molecules that his lineage had learned to work with from the plants. The molecules that would open the door. The molecules he understood that the forest had shared with him so that he could travel to where the ancestors waited. He had not known, could not have known, that those same molecules were already inside him, that his own nervous system, without any plant, without any brew, was generating them continuously in amounts too small to open the door, but amounts that, by their very persistent, quiet presence, suggested the door had a purpose. In 1955, the year Evan Horning confirmed DMT in Anadenanthera seeds, a young Hungarian physician was reading Aldous Huxley's account of his own mescaline experience and thinking very carefully about consciousness and biochemistry and the nature of the mind. He was also, at that moment, composing a letter to a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland, requesting a small supply of a compound called lysergic acid diethylamide. The reply he received would redirect everything. But that is the next chapter of this story. For now, it is enough to sit for a moment in the space between what the Amazonian shamans had always known and what Western science was only beginning to notice. Two bodies of knowledge moving toward the same point from opposite ends of the world. One of them written in botanical preparations and ceremonial song, and the measured transmission of experience across generations. The other written in the precise, cautious language of alkaloid chemistry and enzyme kinetics and peer-reviewed publication. Both pointing at the same molecule, both arriving with different vocabularies and different degrees of certainty at the same uneasy conclusion. there is something here. Something in the chemistry of the mind that reaches, when given the right conditions, towards something it seems to recognize. Something it has perhaps been reaching toward for as long as there have been minds to reach. What that something is, whether it is a hallucination or a destination, a malfunction or a mechanism, a product of the brain or a window through it, is a question that the story has not yet answered, may never answer. The molecule waited. A letter was in the post, and in Zurich a company called Sandoz was already composing its reply. The letter arrived from Zurich sometime in 1953. It was polite, it was firm, and it changed the direction of psychedelic history in a way that nobody involved could have anticipated. Dr. Stephen Szára was 30 years old, a physician and biochemist working in a research laboratory attached to a psychiatric hospital in Budapest. He was, by all accounts, a careful and methodical man, the kind of scientist who moved slowly through problems, because he understood that precision was more valuable than speed. He had trained at the Budapest University of Medicine, earned both his medical degree and his doctorate in science, and had established himself in the study of brain chemistry at a time when brain chemistry was barely a discipline. The relationship between molecules and mental states was, in the early 1950s, a frontier question. Most psychiatry was still conducted in the vocabulary of Freud. The idea that the texture of a person's inner life, its color, its depth, its capacity for suffering, might be explicable in terms of specific molecular events in specific neural pathways was not yet mainstream. It was, in most hospitals, still considered a somewhat eccentric hypothesis. Szára was drawn to it anyway. His interest had been sharpened by two things arriving in quick succession. The first was the news, which had spread through European medical circles like quiet electricity, of a compound called lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, synthesized by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938 and accidentally ingested in 1943, producing an experience so disorienting that Hofmann had initially feared he was losing his mind. By the early 1950s, LSD was being studied seriously, cautiously, seriously, with the measured fascination of scientists who understood they were working with something that lay at the intersection of chemistry and consciousness. Sandoz, the pharmaceutical company that held the compound, was distributing it to research institutions under the name Delicid. The second thing was a book, Aldous Huxley's account of his own mescaline experience, published in 1954 under the title The Doors of Perception, had landed in the European medical world with the quiet force of something that could not be easily categorized. Huxley was not a scientist. He was a novelist and an intellectual, precise and literate, and incapable of imprecision, even when describing the most extreme states of consciousness. What he described in that book, the dissolution of the boundary between self and world, the visual world reorganizing itself around what he called its isness, the sense of encountering something that had always been present but had never before been accessible, struck Szára as a clinical description dressed in literary language. It struck him as data. He decided he needed LSD. He wrote to Sandoz in Zurich. He explained his research interest, the biochemical basis of psychosis, the possibility that certain endogenous compounds might be responsible for the hallucinatory experiences associated with schizophrenia. It was a legitimate scientific inquiry. His credentials were real. His intentions were transparent. His request was specific and carefully worded, Sandoz wrote back. The reply, in essence, was this: Hungary was behind the Iron Curtain. Hungary was a communist country. A compound as powerful as LSD could not be trusted in the hands of researchers operating within the Soviet sphere of influence. The application was denied. There is something almost darkly comic about this in retrospect. The Swiss pharmaceutical company, exercising geopolitical caution, had declined to send a psychedelic drug to a man who wanted to study consciousness. And in doing so, they had redirected that man's attention toward a compound that would prove, by any measure, more powerful, more strange, more inexplicable, and more consequential than LSD had ever been. Szára did not give up. He simply turned in a different direction. He had been reading the same literature that Evan Horning's team in America was working from. The papers on Anadenanthera peregrina, the jojoba snuff, the tryptamine alkaloids found in the seeds of that tree. He had read the Fish, Johnson and Horning paper from 1955 carefully. He understood the chemistry, and he noticed something that others seemed to be passing over without comment, that of the two major alkaloids in the jojoba snuff. Bufotenine had already been tested in humans with unimpressive and somewhat toxic results, while DMT, the second alkaloid, had been identified, chemically described, and then essentially ignored. Nobody had asked what it did. Szára decided to ask. He synthesized DMT himself in his laboratory in Budapest, extracting it from Mimosa hostilis plant material, using a method he had worked out from the existing chemical literature. The synthesis was not technically demanding for someone of his training. The compound came out as a white, crystalline powder. He verified its purity as best he could with the instruments available to him. He had, sitting in a small container on his laboratory bench, a quantity of one of the most powerful psychoactive compounds ever to exist in the history of the world. He did not know this yet. Nobody knew this yet. It was just a compound, an unstudied alkaloid from a South American tree. He began with the method that seemed most logical. He swallowed it. In March of 1956, Szára administered DMT to himself orally, in increasing doses, over a series of self-experiments conducted with careful attention to subjective effects. He took 30 milligrams. He felt nothing. He waited the appropriate length of time and noted the absence of any observable effect. He increased the dose. He tried 50 milligrams. He tried 75. He tried, eventually, 150 milligrams. A dose that, by any reasonable pharmacological standard, ought to have produced something. He felt nothing at all, nothing except, perhaps, a growing sense of puzzlement. His own body was teaching him something that the Amazonian shamans had understood for centuries, though he had no way of knowing this. DMT, taken orally without an MAO inhibitor, is dismantled by the digestive system before it can reach the brain. The monoamine oxidase enzymes in the stomach and intestine intercept the molecule and metabolize it into inactive compounds. The compound reaches the bloodstream in quantities too small to cross into the central nervous system in any meaningful concentration. The mouth is the wrong door. Szára did not have this theoretical framework yet. But he was a scientist, and a scientist does not conclude that a compound has no effect simply because one route of administration has failed. He had already noted from the existing literature on DMT's metabolites that the compound was broken down by amine oxidase enzymes. He had found 3-indole acetic acid in both his blood and urine samples after the oral experiments, confirming that the compound was being processed by his body, just not reaching its destination. he changed his approach. In April of 1956, Stephen Szára prepared a solution of DMT for intramuscular injection. He calculated the dose. He prepared the syringe. He injected it into his own arm. He later recorded that the initial dose he used was approximately 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight. He sat back. He waited. The room was quiet. His laboratory in the Budapest Psychiatric Hospital was, at that hour, still. 60 seconds passed. It began with the visual field. Colors first, not colors as he understood them. Not colors that belonged to the surfaces of things in the room around him, but colors that seemed to come from behind the ordinary spectrum, as if the visible world had been pulled aside like a curtain to reveal a deeper illumination behind it. He described them later as brilliantly colored oriental motifs, patterns, geometric and shifting, and possessing a quality of intention that pure hallucination does not typically possess. The sense not of a mind decorating itself, but of being shown something. Then the geometry deepened into something else. He described spatial distortions, a sense that the dimensions of the room had become unreliable, that the fixed coordinates of physical space, the distance between walls, the relationship between floor and ceiling, had lost their certainty. His body became strange to him. The boundary between himself and the space he occupied grew uncertain. He felt what he would later describe as a disturbance of the schema of his own physical form, a technical, clinical phrase for the experience of no longer being sure in any visceral and immediate sense where he ended and the world began. The effects lasted, by clock time, between 45 minutes and an hour. By the subjective measure of the experience itself, they lasted considerably longer in the way that any genuine disruption of consciousness compresses and expands time unpredictably. When it was over, Szára sat for a long while in the quiet of his laboratory. He was a psychiatrist. He was trained to classify. He reached, professionally, for the vocabulary of his discipline and described what he had just experienced in the language of clinical phenomenology, hallucinations, depersonalization, alterations in body image, and spatial perception. But the clinical vocabulary did not quite reach the thing itself. He knew this. He had not simply perceived distortions. He had been somewhere, and the somewhere had possessed a quality, a density of presence, a sense of significance that exceeded any explanation his training provided, that the word hallucination did not do justice to. He noted this, and he moved on, because that is what scientists do. They note the anomalies and continue. Within months, the experiments had progressed beyond self-administration. Szára assembled a group of volunteer subjects, colleagues, medical professionals, nurses and doctors from the psychiatric hospital where he worked, people whose professional training gave them both the capacity to describe their experiences with precision and the clinical resilience to manage whatever the compound produced. They were between 20 and 42 years of age. They received intramuscular injections of DMT at a dose of approximately 0.8 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Their blood pressure was monitored. Their heart rates were recorded. Their pupil dilation was measured. And every word they said during the experience was written down by Szára himself, sitting at the bedside. The reports were consistent in ways that Szára, as a careful scientist, found difficult to dismiss. Effects began within 3 minutes of injection in several subjects. The physical symptoms were predictable enough: elevated heart rate, dilation of the pupils, the slight flush of physiological arousal that accompanies a sudden and powerful shift in neurochemistry. But the subjective reports were something else. One subject named Bella described an experience of moving through darkness and arriving through what she called a black iron lattice at a bright temple. Others reported presences, not the generic distortions of a visual system under pharmacological stress, but specific encounters with entities that appear to be separate from the self, to possess their own perspective, their own attention, their own capacity for observation, strange creatures, figures that did not belong to the ordinary dream work of the human mind. Szára listened. He noted what his subjects said. He classified their reports professionally as hallucinations, because that was the correct clinical term for perceptual experiences without corresponding external stimuli. But something in the consistency of the reports unsettled his scientific composure. These were different people, different minds, different personal histories, and different inner lives. And yet they were arriving, through the chemistry of this single molecule, at something strikingly similar. Not identical. The specific imagery varied, but the structural quality of the encounter, the sense of beings, of entities, of presences already occupying a space that the compound had made briefly visible. This recurred with a regularity that the word hallucination alone could not fully contain. Szára published his preliminary findings. They circulated quietly through the pharmacological literature. A small number of researchers read them with interest. The world, preoccupied with LSD and mescaline and the broader horizon of psychedelic chemistry, largely absorbed the findings without giving them the weight they deserved. And then, in the autumn of 1956, the world outside the laboratory intervened. On the 23rd of October 1956, the Hungarian Revolution began. Students and workers and soldiers took to the streets of Budapest, tearing down Soviet symbols, calling for independence, for free elections, for the withdrawal of Soviet troops. For a brief period of days that felt, to those living through them, like the edge of something possible, the revolution seemed as though it might succeed. Soviet tanks arrived on the 4th of November. The revolution was crushed. The reckoning that followed was swift and severe. 3 weeks after the uprising, Stephen Szára left Hungary. He left illegally, in the way that people leave countries that have closed their borders, which is to say with very little, and under conditions that required considerable courage. He carried with him a briefcase. The briefcase contained a change of underwear, a couple of sandwiches, his 2 doctoral diplomas, 2 dictionaries, 1 German-Hungarian, 1 English-Hungarian, and glass test tubes containing the molecule he had synthesized and studied. DMT, the compound he had now administered to himself and to 20 volunteers. The compound he had not yet finished studying, whose implications he had barely begun to articulate, but which he understood well enough to carry it with him through whatever came next. He spent some time in refugee camps. He contacted researchers at the University of Vienna and traded a portion of his DMT supply for the opportunity to participate in their LSD studies, a transaction so specific to his particular moment in history that it feels almost fictional, and yet it is documented. He traveled eventually to Berlin. In May of 1957, he attended the first International Congress on Psychotropic Drugs in Milan. Later that year, he arrived in Washington, D.C., where he had secured a position at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, working with a researcher named Joel Elkes at the National Institute of Mental Health. He had crossed half a continent with his test tubes intact. The molecule had arrived in America. What would happen to it there? The brief explosion of interest, the countercultural appropriation, the political panic, and the long enforced silence that followed was already, in a sense, written. The history of psychedelics in the second half of the 20th century is the history of a series of discoveries that the world was not ready for, made by scientists who were not adequately protected from the storms that inevitably gather around knowledge that frightens people. But in the quiet of 1957, Szára was simply a scientist in a new country, with a compound in his briefcase and a question still unanswered in his notebooks. The question was this. In his volunteer trials in Budapest, his subjects had reported entities, presences, beings encountered on the other side of the molecule's chemistry. Szára had classified these as hallucinations because that was the honest and appropriate clinical description. But in the Amazon basin, at that same moment and for centuries before it, the shamans who drank their preparation of vine and leaf were reporting the same beings. Without any knowledge of Budapest, without any knowledge of Szára, without any knowledge of the compound's name or structure or pharmacology, the same door, different keys, the same room on the other side. Szára did not pursue this parallel publicly. He was a scientist, not a philosopher. But later in his life, in interviews and in published reflections, he would acknowledge that this convergence, the consistency of what people encountered through DMT across decades and cultures and centuries, was the part of the story that refused to be resolved by the vocabulary of clinical psychiatry. When these experiences, he said, such as God or strange creatures, appeared in our DMT studies, we did not philosophize about them. As psychiatrists, we simply classified them as hallucinations. He paused, and then he added something that the clinical vocabulary could not quite hold. He said that the brain might be storing something, images, symbols, archetypes, that the molecule released into consciousness. That what the volunteers were encountering was something already present in the deepest architecture of the human mind, waiting for the right chemical key. Or perhaps he left open. Perhaps the compound was not releasing something stored inside the brain. Perhaps it was opening a window. Stephen Szára arrived in Washington in 1957 with very little and with everything. He had his diplomas, he had his dictionaries, he had his test tubes, and he had filed carefully in the notebooks he had carried out of Hungary the most detailed clinical record of human DMT experience that existed anywhere in the world. It was not a long record, 20 volunteers. A series of sessions conducted in a psychiatric hospital in a city that was now behind him. But it was precise, it was honest, and it described something that the scientific community in America had not yet encountered, because nobody in America had yet thought to ask the question he had asked. He began work at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington under Joel Elkes, one of the founding figures of biological psychiatry in the United States, a man who understood, perhaps better than most of his contemporaries, that the relationship between molecular chemistry and human consciousness was not a peripheral question, but the central one. From there, Szára moved into the laboratory of Julius Axelrod, the Nobel laureate whose own work on neurotransmitter metabolism was already reshaping the field. In Axelrod's laboratory, Szára continued what he had started in Budapest, studying the metabolism of DMT and its chemical relatives in both healthy volunteers and in patients. diagnosed with schizophrenia, looking for the biochemical thread that might connect the molecule to the mind's capacity for disorder. The theoretical framework driving this work was called the transmethylation hypothesis. It was an elegant and genuinely plausible idea. If the human body was already producing small quantities of DMT through normal metabolic processes, and if DMT produced, when administered in larger doses, experiences that resembled the symptoms of acute psychosis, the hallucinations, the dissolution of the boundary between self and world, the encounters with beings and presences, then perhaps something had gone wrong in the biochemical regulation of schizophrenic patients. Perhaps their bodies were producing too much. Perhaps the madness that psychiatry struggled to treat pharmacologically was, in part, a disease of endogenous chemistry. Perhaps the key to understanding it was inside the molecule. It was a serious hypothesis. It was pursued seriously over the course of the following decade. Szára and his colleagues and other researchers around the world would conduct dozens of studies attempting to measure DMT and its metabolites in the blood and urine of psychiatric patients, hoping to find elevated concentrations that would support the transmethylation model. The results were, in the end, inconclusive. No clear and reproducible correlation emerged. The hypothesis did not fail dramatically. It simply failed to be confirmed, which is the quieter and more common way that scientific ideas dissolve. The question it had asked remained open. The answer it had proposed remained unverified. But something had been built regardless. A body of research, a clinical database, a set of human experiences documented with care and without sensationalism by scientists who had no agenda beyond understanding. And alongside that body of research, in the broader culture of the late 1950s and early 1960s, something else was building. The psychedelic decade was coming. DMT entered the American cultural conversation not through Szára's careful papers or through the technical literature of biological psychiatry, but through the networks of researchers and intellectuals and artists who were beginning in those years to pass information about consciousness-altering compounds between themselves with the informal enthusiasm of people who had discovered something they believed the world needed to know about. LSD was already circulating. Mescaline was already circulating. Psilocybin, isolated from Mexican mushrooms by Hoffman in 1958, was entering the conversation. And DMT, shorter acting than all of them, more intense, more total in its disruption of ordinary consciousness, was beginning to be noticed. It acquired in those years a nickname that tells you something about the world in which it was circulating. It was called the businessman's trip. The phrase captured something real about the pharmacology. LSD lasted 8 to 12 hours. Mescaline lasted similarly. Psilocybin lasted 4 to 6. These were commitments, a full day or most of one, surrendered to the chemistry. DMT, administered by inhalation of its freebase form or by injection, produced its full effect within seconds and was over, in most cases, within 45 minutes. The geometry of the experience was compressed to a degree that LSD users found almost incomprehensible. The same total dissolution of ordinary consciousness, the same complete rearrangement of perceptual reality, but contained in a time frame that could theoretically be accommodated between meetings, a businessman's lunch hour. Hence the name. The name was flippant. The experience it referred to was not. Those who encountered DMT in those years and wrote about it did not reach for casual language. They reached, typically, for the language of the absolute, for words like terrifying and overwhelming and more real than real, for descriptions that strain the ordinary, vocabulary of human experience to its edges. The brevity of the experience was not a mitigation of its intensity. If anything, the compression made it more total. There was no gradual onset, no period of adjustment, no gentle arrival. There was ordinary consciousness, and then there was not, and the transition between them happened in the time it took to exhale. By the early 1960s, psychedelic research in the United States was at what would prove to be its historical peak. Between 1951 and 1966, more than 1,000 papers were published in peer-reviewed scientific literature describing experiments with LSD alone. The compound was being studied as a treatment for alcoholism, for anxiety in terminal cancer patients, for obsessive neurosis, for the cluster of symptoms that would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. The results in many of these studies were promising enough to justify serious clinical interest. The research community was cautious, but genuinely engaged. There was a sense in those years that the pharmacology of consciousness was a frontier that was opening, that the compounds being studied were tools rather than threats, and that the scientific and medical communities had arrived at the edge of something important. Szára was part of this world. He continued his work at the NIH through the 1960s, characterizing the biochemistry of DMT and its closest relatives, diethyltryptamine and dipropyltryptamine, mapping their pharmacokinetics, describing their metabolism, building the molecular portrait of a family of compounds that the world had barely begun to examine. He was careful. He was productive. He published consistently. He worked within the institutional framework of American science, with the disciplined adaptability of someone who had already survived the loss of one world and understood that the next one required its own forms of patience. And then, gathering at the edges of that world, the storm arrived. It had been building for years, and its origins were not entirely the fault of any single person, though certain figures concentrated its energy in ways that are difficult to separate from the history. Timothy Leary was a psychologist, a researcher, genuinely brilliant and genuinely reckless in proportions that proved, ultimately, fatal to the broader project he believed he was serving. He had begun with rigorous work. The Harvard psilocybin project had produced real data and genuine insights. But he had moved, with increasing speed, from scientific inquiry towards something closer to a religious movement, a cultural crusade, a deliberate provocation of the institutional authority he had come to see as the primary obstacle between humanity and its own liberation. His public advocacy was vivid and confrontational and impossible to ignore. Turn on, tune in, drop out. The phrase was designed to be a slogan, and it worked as a slogan, which meant it did the work that slogans do. It stripped away complexity, it invited broad adoption, and it frightened precisely the people it needed not to frighten. The cultural panic that followed was not exclusively Leary's creation. It was fed by newspaper coverage that traded in the most extreme cases of adverse reaction. It was fed by the visibility of the counterculture and the political anxieties of an administration that saw in the spreading use of consciousness-altering compounds among young people a threat that was simultaneously moral, political, and social. The Vietnam War was creating a generation of protesters. The civil rights movement was creating a generation of dissenters. and the psychedelics were creating, at least in the perception of those whose authority was being challenged, a generation of people who had stopped trusting the institutions that governed their lives. President Nixon had, in 1968, campaigned in part on a platform of restoring order. He had identified, for the purposes of political strategy, two primary enemies: the anti-war left and the black community. Drugs, and in particular the drugs associated with both groups, heroin with urban black communities, psychedelics with white countercultural protesters, were a politically useful target. The machinery of federal law was already moving. In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act into law. It came into full effect in 1971. The act created 5 schedules of controlled substances ranked by their potential for abuse and their accepted medical utility. Schedule 1 was the most restrictive category, reserved for compounds deemed to have high abuse potential and no accepted medical use. The compounds placed in Schedule 1 included heroin, they included cannabis, and they included, without distinction or nuance, the entire class of psychedelic compounds that researchers had been studying for 2 decades: LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the molecule found in hundreds of plant species, the molecule produced endogenously by every mammal studied, the molecule whose presence in the human body had been confirmed by Julius Axelrod in the laboratory down the hall from where these decisions were being made, was placed in the same legal category as heroin. The research did not slow down. It stopped. The infrastructure of psychedelic science, the approved researchers, the institutional protocols, the clinical frameworks that had been built over 20 years of careful work, was dismantled with the thoroughness that only legal prohibition can achieve. Sandoz withdrew Delicid from the market. Research supplies dried up. Funding disappeared. The scientists who had been working in this field were not arrested. They were simply made irrelevant by the removal of any legal pathway through which their work could continue. Some of them moved on to other areas of research. Some of them did not move on exactly, but simply went quiet in the way that people go quiet when the conversation they were having has been declared illegal. Szára himself transitioned in 1968 to a position at the Center for Studies of Narcotics and Drug Abuse. He would later become chief of the biomedical branch of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the very institution whose parent organization had, in another part of its machinery, helped bring about the prohibition that had ended the research he had dedicated his scientific life to. There is a particular quality of irony in that. He spent the latter part of his career working within the bureaucracy of the drug war on the research side, advocating, quietly and consistently, for the scientific study of psychedelic compounds as keys to the understanding of the brain. He never stopped believing they were important. He never stopped arguing that what he had seen in his Budapest laboratory, what his volunteers had reported, what the clinical literature had documented, warranted continued investigation. The world was not listening. For 20 years, the silence held. The question of what DMT did, what it opened, what it showed, what the consistency of the entity encounters meant, what the endogenous presence of the molecule in the human body implied about the architecture of consciousness itself, went unanswered. The door that Szára had opened in 1956, the same door that the Amazonian shamans had been opening for centuries, was bolted shut by an act of Congress and left that way. The molecule remained. It remained in the plants. It remained in the body. it remained in trace quantities, circulating through the bloodstream of every human being alive, doing whatever it had always done, performing whatever function evolution had designed it for, entirely indifferent to the political history that had made its study temporarily impossible. It waited, as molecules do, without impatience. And in 1990, in a university hospital in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a psychiatrist named Rick Strassman began filling out paperwork. He was requesting permission to study DMT in human subjects. The approval process would take years. The institutional resistance would be significant. The paperwork alone would constitute a minor monument to bureaucratic caution. But the door was about to open again. And what came through it in the sterile quiet of a university research ward would prove to be stranger, more consistent, and more deeply disturbing to the rational framework of the man conducting the research than anything the previous 30 years of silence had prepared him for. The paperwork took years. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of what confronted Rick Strassman when he decided, in the late 1980s, that the question of DMT's role in human consciousness could no longer be left unanswered. He was a psychiatrist at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, tenured, respected within his field, possessed of the kind of institutional standing that makes certain kinds of difficult requests possible. He was also, in ways that mattered to the shape of his research, a man whose inner life had always run alongside his scientific one rather than being subsumed by it. He had spent 20 years practicing Zen Buddhism. He had received lay ordination in a Western Buddhist order. He had led a meditation group. He was not a man who considered the inner world of human experience to be merely a side effect of biochemistry, even though biochemistry was his professional instrument. His interest in DMT had developed from an earlier research focus on melatonin, the pineal gland's primary product, the hormone that governs the body's relationship to darkness and to sleep. The pineal gland is a small, pine cone-shaped structure sitting deep in the center of the brain, roughly at its geometric midpoint. It weighs, in an adult human being, less than 0.2 of a gram. For the French philosopher René Descartes, writing in the 17th century, it had been the seat of the soul, the point where the immaterial mind made contact with the material body. For the Hindu tradition, it was associated with the Ajna Chakra, the sixth energy center, sometimes called the third eye, located at the point between the eyebrows and understood to be the seat of intuition and higher perception. For the ancient Egyptians, the pineal had been connected to the eye of Horus, the god of sky and kingship, the symbol of protection and royal power. These associations were old and widespread, and in the framework of modern neuroscience, largely decorative. The pineal gland, science had established by the 20th century, produced melatonin. It regulated circadian rhythms. It told the body when it was dark. It was a clock, not a portal. Strassman was not so sure the story was finished. He had noticed in the course of his melatonin research that the enzymatic machinery required to produce DMT, the N-MT enzyme that Julius Axelrod had identified in 1961, was present in the pineal gland. He had noticed that DMT's molecular structure was closely related to melatonin's. He had noticed that both molecules were tryptamines, both derived from the same amino acid precursor, both operating in territories of the brain's chemistry that were not fully mapped. And he had arrived at a hypothesis that was speculative, that he was careful to present as speculative, but that he believed was worth testing. The hypothesis was this, that the pineal gland, under certain extreme conditions, the shock of birth, the process of dying, the deepest states of meditation, the threshold experiences that human beings across all cultures had described as mystical or transcendent, might release quantities of DMT significantly larger than the trace amounts present in ordinary waking life, that these releases might be the biochemical substrate of the experiences that mystics and near-death survivors and dying patients had been describing for millennia. That the spirit, in other words, might have a molecule, that what human beings had been calling the soul's departure from the body was, in some measurable chemical sense, an event. He understood that this hypothesis would require evidence, and to gather evidence, he needed to study DMT in human beings, which meant navigating the apparatus of federal drug regulation that had been designed 20 years earlier to make exactly this kind of research impossible. The approval process required sign-off from the Food and Drug Administration. It required DEA Schedule 1 research registration. It required approval from the University of New Mexico's Institutional Review Board, its Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, its Radiation Safety Committee, and its General Clinical Research Center. It required a protocol that addressed every conceivable risk with sufficient thoroughness to satisfy regulators who were, understandably, cautious about approving the administration of one of the most powerful psychedelics known to science to healthy human volunteers in a university hospital. Strassman spent the better part of 2 years working through this process. The resistance he encountered was not primarily scientific. The scientific case for the research was, he argued, straightforward. DMT was endogenous. Its pharmacology was reasonably well characterized. The existing human studies conducted by Szára and others in the 1950s and 1960s had established a reasonable safety profile. The resistance was institutional and cultural. It was the residue of 20 years of prohibition, the reflexive caution of bureaucracies that had been told for 2 decades that these compounds were dangerous and without legitimate use, and that anyone who thought otherwise was either naive or dangerous themselves. He persisted. In 1990, Rick Strassman received the first U.S. government approval for human psychedelic research in more than 20 years. The approval was for a dose-response study of intravenous DMT, a systematic investigation of how the compound behaved at different doses in healthy human volunteers, measuring its physiological and psychological effects with the precision that the earlier Budapest studies had not been able to achieve. The clinical setting was deliberate and specific. Room 531 of the University of New Mexico Hospital's General Clinical Research Center was a standard hospital room. A bed, monitoring equipment, the functional furniture of medical procedure. Strassman had thought carefully about the environment. The setting in which a psychedelic experience occurs is understood by researchers and by the broader tradition of ceremonial use alike to be not incidental but constitutive. The container shapes the content. He equipped the room with indirect lighting. He played gentle music. He trained his research nurses, Cindy and Kathy, to sit with volunteers through the sessions, with the calm, grounded presence of people who understood they were accompanying someone through something significant. The volunteers were carefully screened. They were healthy. They had prior experience with psychedelics, which was considered important. The research team wanted people who had some framework for navigating non-ordinary states of consciousness, who would not be overwhelmed by the sudden radical departure from consensus reality that DMT reliably produced. They were told what the research was. They gave informed consent in the fullest sense, not the bureaucratic pro forma of a signature on a form, but the consent of people who understood, as clearly as anyone could understand before experiencing it, what they were agreeing to. The sessions began. A nurse inserted an intravenous catheter into a volunteer's arm. The volunteer lay back on the bed. The music played softly, and Strassman administered the compound. At the lower doses, the effects were manageable. Colors intensified. Visual patterns appeared. The emotional tone shifted, not unpleasantly in most cases, though the speed of onset was startling even to those who had been told to expect it. The compound entered the bloodstream directly. There was no gradual build, no slow tide coming in. It arrived. At higher doses approaching 0.4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight and above, something different happened. The volunteers did not report visual distortions. They did not report that the room had become strange, or that the walls had developed interesting patterns, or that their emotional state had undergone some pleasant pharmaceutical coloring. They reported that the room had ceased to exist, that they had gone somewhere, that the somewhere they had gone to was not empty. There were beings there. More than half of Strassman's volunteers, healthy, screened, psychologically stable adults who had given informed consent and been carefully prepared, reported profound encounters with what they consistently described as non-human intelligences. The descriptions varied in their specific imagery. Some reported creatures that felt insectoid, compound eyes, chitinous geometry, a quality of alien precision that was more cold than threatening. Others reported beings that felt essentially human in form, but radically different in nature, vast, ancient, luminous presences that seemed to regard the arriving volunteer with the measured attention of entities for whom this encounter was routine. Others reported what could only be described as entities of pure geometry, intelligences expressed through mathematical form, beings who communicated not in language, but in the direct transmission of meaning. What they encountered was not in any case passive. The beings were active. They attended to the volunteers. They communicated, or attempted to communicate, or communicated in modes that the volunteers could only partially receive. Several volunteers described a sense of having been expected, of arriving somewhere that the inhabitants of that place already knew about, already anticipated, and were prepared to receive. One volunteer described the experience as being intercepted, not threatened, received, as if the transition to the DMT space was not an intrusion into somewhere foreign, but an arrival at somewhere that had been waiting. Strassman sat with his research nurses in room 531 and listened to these accounts in real time, transcribing every word into his bedside notes, while the volunteers, eyes closed, breathing steadily, moved through the 15 minutes of the compound's peak effect. He had expected mystical experiences. His Buddhist background and his theoretical framework had prepared him for reports of unity consciousness, of dissolution of the self into a larger whole, of the kind of transpersonal experience that meditation and psychedelic research had both documented over decades. He had not been prepared for this. The entity encounters were not mystical in the traditional sense. They were not experiences of boundless love, of merging with the universe, of the self dissolving into undifferentiated awareness. They were, if anything, more specific than that, more concrete, more interactive, more disturbing in the way that a concrete and specific encounter with something genuinely unknown is more disturbing than an abstract feeling of transcendence. The volunteers were not dissolved. They were present, and they were meeting something. Strassman, trained in Buddhist psychology, reached for the Buddhist framework and found it insufficient. Buddhism proposes that the phenomena encountered in deep meditation are generated by the mind, that the beings and visions and presences of meditative experience are products of the practitioner's own consciousness, projections of the mind onto the screen of awareness. This framework, applied to his volunteers' experiences, would suggest that the entities were hallucinations, elaborate, consistent, emotionally compelling hallucinations, but hallucinations nonetheless, constructions of the mind under chemical stress. But the volunteers did not experience them that way. They experienced them as separate, as genuinely other, as possessing their own agendas, their own knowledge, their own existence independent of the observer. And the consistency of this quality across 60 different volunteers, different backgrounds, different personal histories, different prior experiences with psychedelics, was difficult to explain as the product of individual minds generating their own private imagery. Too many minds were generating the same thing. Strassman did not resolve this. He was honest enough not to pretend he could. He continued the research. He conducted a tolerance study. He conducted mechanism of action studies. He administered, over the 5 years of the project, approximately 400 doses of DMT to nearly 60 human volunteers. He generated a dataset that was, in its scope and rigor, unlike anything that had existed in the prior history of DMT research. And he filled more than 1,000 pages of bedside notes with the verbatim accounts of people who had been somewhere, met something, and returned to room 531 profoundly and permanently altered by the encounter. Something else accumulated alongside the data, though it was harder to quantify. Strassman found, as the research progressed and the entity encounters multiplied, that the rational frameworks he had brought to the project were proving less and less adequate to the material he was gathering. The Buddhist model had failed him. The neuroscientific model, DMT as a pharmacological disruption of normal perceptual processing, the entities as artifacts of a destabilized visual cortex, felt increasingly unsatisfying in the face of volunteers who described interactions too specific, too informative, too apparently independent to be explained as noise in a neurological signal. He found himself, late in the project, beginning to sit with a question he had not anticipated needing to ask. What if the entities were not generated by the brain? What if DMT was not producing an experience but enabling a perception, functioning not as a generator of false data, but as a receiver of real data that the ordinary unmodified nervous system simply lacked the bandwidth to process? He did not answer this question. He noted it. He acknowledged in the book he eventually published in 2001, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, a landmark work that introduced the broader public to both the research and the unanswered questions it had produced, that the experience of conducting this research had changed him in ways he had not anticipated. The weight of what his volunteers had reported, the consistency of the encounters across hundreds of sessions, the failure of his existing frameworks to absorb the data, all of it had produced in him a kind of productive disorientation a sense of having arrived at the edge of what his training had equipped him to understand. He ended the research in 1995. He cited problems both inside and outside the research environment. The institutional support that had, with such difficulty, been assembled, had become strained. The questions the research was raising were beginning to exceed what a university clinical research setting was equipped to handle. And Strassman himself, the careful scientist who had spent years building the legal and institutional architecture necessary to ask these questions, found that the answers arriving through room 531 were leading him somewhere that the architecture of Western clinical research had not been built to go. He left the University of New Mexico. He left academic psychiatry. He moved eventually to a quieter life in Taos. The research had been conducted. The data existed. The 1,000 pages of bedside notes documented in precise and sober clinical language what 60 ordinary people had encountered through the chemistry of a molecule that their own bodies were already producing. And the question that had been there from the beginning, the question the Bolivian shaman had not needed to ask because the plants had already answered it. The question that Szára had noted and filed and never quite resolved. The question that Strassman had pursued through years of paperwork and clinical procedure and had arrived at the edge of without crossing remained. Why? Why does the body make this molecule? Why, when that molecule is present in sufficient concentration, do human beings consistently encounter the same beings, the same presences, the same non-human intelligences that appear to be waiting for them on the other side of ordinary consciousness? What is the door for? There is a fact about DMT that tends to stop people mid-sentence when they first encounter it, not the fact of its effects, not the entities, not the dissolution of ordinary reality, not the reports of arriving somewhere that feels more real than the room you left behind. Those facts are strange enough, and we have spent considerable time in their company over the course of this history. But there is another fact, quieter and in some ways more deeply unsettling than any of them, and it is this. You are already making it, right now, in the dark, while you rest, while your breathing slows, and the day recedes, and the architecture of ordinary consciousness loosens its grip. Your body is synthesizing, through its own biochemical machinery, the same molecule that sent a Hungarian psychiatrist through the walls of his laboratory in 1956. The same molecule that the Amazonian shamans had spent centuries learning to release from plants and to deliver to the nervous system in quantities large enough to open the door. The same molecule that sent 60 ordinary people in a New Mexico hospital, room to wherever it is that the entities wait. Your body makes it, has always made it. Every mammal studied makes it. Rats make it. Rabbits make it. Non-human primates make it. The enzyme required to synthesize it, indolethylamine N-methyltransferase, NMT, has been found in the human cerebral cortex, in the hippocampus, in the choroid plexus, in the retinal ganglion neurons, and in the pineal gland. The precursor molecules it requires are present and continuously available. The biosynthetic pathway is short and metabolically efficient. The body is not making DMT by accident, the way a factory might occasionally produce a byproduct that nobody intended. It is making it with the dedicated machinery of intentional biochemical production. For what purpose, nobody can fully say. This is where the story arrives, not at an answer, but at the quality of the question itself. And the quality of the question is remarkable, because it sits at the intersection of pharmacology, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, philosophy, and something that none of those disciplines has a comfortable name for. The question is not simply scientific. It carries within it the accumulated weight of everything that has come before it in this history. The shaman's pouch in the Bolivian cave, the letter from Sandoz, the quiet Budapest laboratory, at the moment the needle was withdrawn, the 1,000 pages of bedside notes from room 531. All of it has been pointing here, at this question, at the fact that the molecule responsible for the most extreme alteration of human consciousness ever documented is not foreign to the human body, is not an intrusion, is not something the body encounters from the outside and attempts to process. It is something the body produces from the inside, continuously, throughout the entirety of a human life, in amounts that remain. And this is precisely the crux of the mystery, just below the threshold required to produce any discernible effect on consciousness, just below, not absent. Below the threshold, the difference between those two things is the distance between a locked door and a door left, carefully, almost imperceptibly, ajar. The scientific debate about what endogenous DMT does, or might do, or might have been designed by evolution to do, has been ongoing since Julius Axelrod first found the machinery for its production in rabbit lung tissue in 1961 and quietly noted the implications in the pages of science. Over the 60-plus years since that publication, the debate has refined itself into several distinct and partially overlapping questions, none of which has been definitively answered, and each of which, when examined closely, opens into further questions rather than closing into resolution. The first question is the one that Strassman made famous, and the one that has attracted the most popular attention, and which has also attracted the most rigorous scientific criticism. It is the question of the pineal gland. The pineal gland has, as we have noted, a history of mystical association that predates any scientific understanding of its function by several thousand years. Descartes called it the seat of the soul. Hindu tradition called it the third eye. Ancient Egyptian cosmology connected it to the Eye of Horus. These associations are not evidence of anything. They are, at most, evidence that human beings across cultures and centuries have intuited something significant about a small structure sitting at the geometric center of the brain, have sensed through some avenue that was not scientific but was not entirely uninformed either, that this particular piece of the body's architecture was doing something more than its obvious mechanical function suggested. Strassman, approaching this history from a position of scientific training and Buddhist contemplative practice simultaneously, proposed the hypothesis that has since become probably the most widely discussed idea in the popular understanding of DMT. He suggested that the pineal gland, under extreme physiological conditions, birth, death, near death, the deepest states of meditation, might release large amounts of DMT, that the surge of this molecule into the bloodstream and from there into the brain might be the biochemical event underlying the experiences that human beings across all cultures have described at these thresholds. The tunnels of light, the beings, the sense of leaving the body, the feeling of arriving somewhere that is more real than the ordinary world, the encounter with presences that seem to have been waiting. It was a hypothesis. Strassman was careful, in his book and in his public discussions, to present it as exactly that. A speculation built on circumstantial evidence and theoretical coherence rather than direct experimental confirmation. He acknowledged that the pineal gland's primary known function was the production of melatonin, and that the quantities of melatonin it produced, approximately 30 micrograms per day, were vastly smaller than the 25 milligrams of DMT that would be required to produce a psychoactive effect. He acknowledged that the arithmetic did not obviously work. The scientific response to the pineal hypothesis has been, in the main, skeptical. David Nichols, one of the most respected pharmacologists working in the field of psychedelic research, published a careful and rigorous paper in 2018 specifically addressing the DMT-pineal connection, and his conclusion was direct. The evidence, he argued, did not support the hypothesis. The pineal gland was too small, its production capacity too limited, its known biochemical output too melatonin-focused to be a plausible source of psychoactive quantities of DMT. He proposed, instead, that the endorphins and other neurochemicals released under extreme physiological stress were more likely candidates for the near-death experience and its associated phenomenology. The DMT pineal connection, he suggested, was a compelling narrative that had outrun its evidence. This is a reasonable scientific position. It is not, however, the end of the conversation, because the pineal gland was not, it turned out, the only place where the story was happening. In 2019, a research team at the University of Michigan, led by Dr. Jimo Borjigin, a neuroscientist whose interest in DMT had begun somewhat accidentally when she was preparing lecture notes on the pineal gland, and stumbled across the online community of people still convinced of its mystical significance, published a study in the journal Scientific Reports that introduced a finding nobody had quite anticipated. Using a process called in situ hybridization, which maps the location of specific RNA transcripts within brain tissue, Borjigin's team had looked for the two enzymes required to synthesize DMT, AADC and INMT, within rat brain tissue. They found both. They found them not just in the pineal gland, but throughout the neocortex and the hippocampus, the brain regions associated with higher cognitive function, with learning and memory, with the processing of complex experience. The machinery for DMT production was not confined to a tiny gland on the brain's roof. It was distributed through the brain's most sophisticated architecture. And then Borjigin's team did something further. They induced cardiac arrest in their rat subjects and measured DMT levels in the visual cortex during and after the event. What they found was that DMT concentrations in the visual cortex rose significantly during cardiac arrest, significantly enough to approach the levels found in rats that had been administered DMT exogenously from outside the body. The surge occurred independently of whether the pineal gland was intact or had been removed. The pineal gland, whatever its contribution to the story, was not the source of this particular flood. The brain itself, its neurons, its distributed biochemical machinery, appeared to be producing the surge. This finding sits in the literature without having been fully absorbed by the field, because what it implies, if it translates to human biology in the way that rat models typically do, is considerable. It implies that the dying brain, the brain in the final minutes of its electrical life, as oxygen fails and the biochemical order of consciousness begins to dissolve, may be flooding itself with one of the most powerful psychoactive compounds known to science. That the extraordinary experiences reported by people who have been clinically dead and revived, the sense of departure from the body, the tunnel, the light, the beings, The feeling of arrival somewhere both familiar and utterly unknown may have a molecular substrate. May. The word carries its full weight here. This is hypothesis built on animal data, and the distance between a rat's cardiac arrest and a human near-death experience is not a distance that can be crossed without significant experimental work that has not yet been done. But the direction of the finding is not trivial, and the fact that it echoes, structurally, phenomenologically, the reports that Szára's volunteers gave in Budapest, that Strassman's volunteers gave in Albuquerque, and that the Amazonian shamans had been giving for centuries, is not something that rigorous science can simply ignore. The second major line of inquiry into endogenous DMT concerns the sigma-1 receptor, and it opens a dimension of the story that is entirely separate from consciousness and experience and entities and mystical thresholds. It opens a dimension that is cellular, molecular, almost mundanely biological, except that its implications are, once again, not mundane at all. In 2009, a research team led by Dominique Fontanilla published a paper in Science identifying DMT as an endogenous ligand for the sigma-1 receptor, a protein found throughout the central nervous system and throughout the peripheral tissues of the body. The sigma-1 receptor had been known for decades. It had been studied in the context of various neurological and psychiatric conditions. But its natural ligand, the endogenous molecule it was designed by evolution to respond to, had never been identified. It was known as an orphan receptor, a lock without a known key. The key Fontanilla's team proposed was DMT. The sigma-1 receptor is involved in cellular protection under conditions of stress. It plays a role in anti-inflammatory responses. It is implicated in neuroprotection, the processes by which neurons defend themselves against damage and death when oxygen is reduced or toxic conditions threaten. It promotes cell survival. It supports tissue regeneration. It has been found to play a role in immune function and in the regulation of neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize its own connections in response to experience and learning. If DMT is the natural ligand for this receptor, then the endogenous production of DMT in the body may have nothing to do with consciousness or mystical experience or the entities that populate the threshold states. It may be fundamentally a housekeeping function, a cellular protective mechanism, the body making a compound that keeps its cells alive under stress, that modulates inflammation, that supports the survival of neurons under conditions of threat. The psychoactive effects of the molecule in this reading would be almost incidental, a consequence of what happens when the protective cellular chemistry intersects with the brain's perceptual machinery at doses high enough to overwhelm the threshold. The lock that the shamans, on the scientists, and the dying and the dreaming had been picking, in this reading, was not primarily a door to another world. It was a component of the body's immune system. This is, from a certain angle, a deflating possibility, and from another angle, it is one of the most astonishing things that the history of this molecule has produced. Because if DMT is a cellular protectant, if its primary biological role is the defense of living tissue under stress, then the fact that it also, at elevated concentrations, at the thresholds of birth and death and chemical induction, opens the mind to experiences that the most rigorously honest researchers in the field have been unable to explain away, is not a coincidence to be smoothed over. It is a question to be sat with. There are, when all the evidence is laid out in the long, quiet corridor of this history, Essentially, three positions that a careful and honest mind can occupy in relation to the endogenous DMT mystery. The first is the reductive position. DMT is a trace metabolite, a byproduct of normal tryptophan metabolism, present in the body in quantities too small to produce any psychoactive effect under normal circumstances, and probably not produced in quantities sufficient to do so, even at the physiological extremes. The entity encounters are hallucinations, the brain under pharmacological or physiological stress, generating imagery from its own deep reserves of symbol and archetype, producing experiences that feel radically external, but are in fact radically internal. The consistency of those experiences across cultures and individuals reflects the shared architecture of the human brain, not the existence of any external domain they describe. This is a defensible position. It is the position of David Nichols, among others, and it is not without evidence. The second position is the neurological mystery position. Something is happening. The endogenous presence of DMT is not noise. The INMT enzyme is real. The sigma-1 receptor connection is real. The cardiac arrest surge is real. The consistency of the entity encounters across 60 of Strassman's volunteers, across Szára's Budapest subjects, across centuries of Amazonian shamanic tradition, is a data point that deserves more weight than the first position gives it. The brain is doing something with this molecule, something that evolution has preserved across millions of years and across the entire class of mammals. And we do not yet know what it is. This uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is an honest acknowledgement of the limits of current understanding, and it is the position that most rigorous researchers in the field currently occupy. The third position is the one that the shamans have occupied for as long as they have been drinking the vine by firelight, and that some of the scientists, Strassman most publicly among them, have found themselves drawn toward despite their training's resistance to it. It is the position that the consistent experiences across cultures and centuries, the beings, the entities, the presences encountered on the other side of the molecule's chemistry, are consistent because they are describing something real, that DMT does not generate the experience but enables a perception, that what the nervous system encounters at the extreme concentration of this molecule is not a hallucination, but a contact, that the door the shamans have been walking through for 1,000 years, that Szára walked through in 1956, that 60 ordinary people walked through in room 531 in Albuquerque, opens onto something. What that something is, none of the three positions can say with certainty. The shamans have their language for it. The scientists have their instruments, which have not yet been built to measure it. And the people who have been there, the volunteers, the practitioners, the dying and the briefly dead and the revived, have their testimony, which is consistent and specific, and which the language of hallucination does not quite contain. And so the molecule sits in its mystery, in the leaves of hundreds of plants, in the roots of grasses, in the venom of certain toads that move slowly through the desert night, and in the chemistry of the human body circulating quietly through the bloodstream, present in the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain, synthesized by enzymes distributed through the neocortex and the hippocampus, the very structures responsible for memory, for learning, for the processing of experience. The man in the Bolivian cave 1,000 years ago sealed his tools into a pouch made of fox snouts and left it in the cold dark of the rock shelter. He left it intentionally. This is what the archaeologists concluded. The placement was deliberate. The pouch was stored rather than abandoned, the objects inside it preserved with the care of a practitioner who understood their value. He did not know, could not have known, that 1,000 years later, a team of scientists would extract residue from the interior of that pouch and confirm through instruments he had no framework to imagine what he had been working with. He did not need to know. He already knew. Stephen Szára died on the 1st of August 2021 at the age of 98. He had lived long enough to see the molecule he carried out of Hungary in a briefcase, through the refugee camps and the university corridors of Vienna and Berlin, across the Atlantic to the fluorescent-lit laboratories of Washington, become the subject of a global conversation about consciousness and therapy and the nature of the human mind. He had lived long enough to see the prohibition that had silenced his work begin, slowly and uncertainly, to lift. To see the psychedelic research that had been declared illegal in 1970 begin to be rehabilitated, one careful clinical trial at a time, in the journals and the universities of the world he had fled to. In the last years of his life, he was asked, as he had been asked many times across many decades, about the entities, about the beings his volunteers had reported, about whether he believed that what they had encountered was a hallucination or something else. He said, as a psychiatrist, he had classified them as hallucinations. He said this was the honest clinical answer. And then he said something else. He said that the brain might be storing images and symbols so ancient and so deep that the molecule simply released them into perception, that what the volunteers were seeing might be something already there, not generated by the drug, but uncovered by it. He left the question open, as he always had, as all the honest people in the story, in the end, have done. Rick Strassman is still alive, still writing, still thinking. Jimo Borjigin is still in her laboratory at the University of Michigan, still following the molecule's trail through the rat brain, still asking what the surge at cardiac arrest means. The Shipibo Konibo are still singing their Icaros in the Amazon, still navigating the space that their lineage has been navigating for as long as the memory of their tradition reaches. The molecule is still in the plants, still in your blood, still at the threshold. Tonight, as your breathing slows and the details of the day release their grip, there is a molecule moving quietly through the pathways of your nervous system, 14 atoms long, present in every mammal studied, produced by the same enzymatic machinery that builds your neurotransmitters and your hormones and the chemical architecture of your inner life. The question of what it is doing there has been asked for 60 years by some of the most careful minds in pharmacology and neuroscience and psychiatry. The question has not been answered. Perhaps it will be. Perhaps the instruments that can answer it have not yet been built, or the framework that can contain the answer has not yet been constructed. Or perhaps the shamans were right, and the answer was never the kind of thing that instruments were built to find. The cave in Bolivia is still there. The rock walls still hold the ochre paintings of hands that have been gone for 1,000 years. The pouch made of fox snouts is in a laboratory now, its chemical residue catalogued, its contents known. The shaman who sealed it in the dark, who handled those carved bone spatulas and those hollow tubes with the practiced care of someone who understood what they were for, has been gone for a millennium. But whatever he was reaching toward, whatever door he was learning to open, whatever presences he was traveling to consult, they appear to still be waiting. This has been the history of dimethyltryptamine, the spirit molecule, the molecule inside you. Good night.